Chris, can you hear me? Let me audio. Yes, you can.
Good morning, everybody. This is Chris Hislop, the Executive Director at the Montana World Affairs Council. Welcome to another episode of Connect Montana, where we bring the world to Montana and Montana to the world. It's Peace Week here at Connect Montana, and we're so happy to have our good friends from the Jeanette Rankin Peace Center here in Missoula joining us in partnership in bringing you a number of these events. Today, we have a good friend of mine, Rania Dagash-Kamara. Rania and I met in southern Iraq in 2003, where we were part of the UN humanitarian mission, and we've been friends ever since. So I'm very happy to welcome Rania. She is now the Chief of Policy and Best Practices in the UN's Department of Peace Operations in New York, where she supports knowledge sharing and guidance development across UN peace missions. She has mostly worked in conflict and post-conflict settings in humanitarian emergencies and peace missions in Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. Her work included supporting communities and governments during conflict, natural disasters, and political transitions. Currently, Rania is involved in several exercises that look into the future of peacekeeping operations and remains a practical optimist. Rania Dagash-Kamara is Sudanese, a daughter, sister, wife, and mother. Rania, you are very welcome to Connect Montana.
Thank you very much, Chris. I'm just checking audio. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Apologies, that was my father. All
Go
right.
ahead.
Thank you very much, Chris. And thank you for having me today. It's really an honor to join you and to see you, old friend. I was delighted to get the opportunity to speak to you during Peace Week, a great time for us to reflect on what makes our peace continuum. And I was even more delighted to know that Harriet was with you also recently, and that she spoke to the importance of peacemaking and political settlements in conflict around the world. Because what I would like to do today is to build on that and share some of my observations and reflections on a complementary part to peacemaking, which is peacekeeping, and that's the part that I work in. And that came into play after the Second World War as well. So as many of you know, after the Second World War, the world was tired and confused, and it was a big moment, and it was time to redesign the world in a way that was going to secure us from, you know, additional wars and to create an environment for prosperity. So a lot of confusion was at play at the time. I think very similar to where we are today, to be honest. And a liberal world order was created in which the UN became one of those pillars. And we came in as the United Nations, we the people, as the charter starts, and we came in with a commitment that promised to save future generations from the scourge of war. We also promised to maintain international peace and security, and to create prosperity and help build relations between countries while maintaining human rights. And I think many would argue that over those past 7 decades, that there were degrees of peace and prosperity and stability, not without their challenges, but certainly they put us in a relatively good place. I am now challenged to share my screen, but I would like to just do that. I am challenged. Chris,
That's okay, Rania. If it's not working, maybe you can just go ahead and hit on some of the key points.
Okay, maybe that would work. So I wanted to share a little bit about who we are in peacekeeping, basically, and that fundamentally this started 70 years ago, where the first peacekeeping mission was deployed by the United Nations Security Council. And since then, it's been 75 years and 71 peacekeeping operations with more than 1 million men and women who've served in those. Peacekeeping, I would argue, is still one of the most effective tools that the United Nations and the multilateral system as a whole has. The idea or the notion of an impartial force deployed not to shoot or to kill, but to separate warring parties and to keep the peace and the political settlements that Harriet was referring to also earlier. We go in, we risk lives, we go in to protect lives, and we work in some of the world's most difficult contexts, but to protect some of the most vulnerable in the world. And it's a unique expression of global solidarity and partnership that's proven to work and to reduce potential for renewed conflict and to create stability for these peace processes to basically hold. The first mission that was deployed in 1948 was deployed in the Middle East. And the early years of peacekeeping, and I'm going to divide this into the early years in the post-Cold War era, and then where we are today and how we need your help and support today. The early years basically were born at a time when the Cold War rivalries were paralyzing the UN Security Council. And peacekeeping was limited to maintaining ceasefires and to monitoring and stabilizing situations on the ground. So we would go in unarmed military observers, and we would go in with lightly armed troops and monitor and report and do confidence building roles predominantly. And the first two peacekeeping missions actually were the UN Truce Supervision Organization, UNSO, and that was followed quickly by the military observer group in India and Pakistan. Both of those missions remain today. And in the 60s and the 70s, we established a whole slew of short-term missions in Congo, in the Dominican Republic, in West New Guinea, and in Yemen, and in Cyprus, and in the Middle East. In '88, there was great support for UN peacekeeping, and in fact, we won the Nobel Peace Prize at the time. And I'll actually quote what the Nobel Committee cited: that the peacekeeping forces, through their efforts, made important contributions towards the realization of one of the fundamental tenets of the UN. And the World Organization has come to play a central role in world affairs and has been invested in increasing trust. Now, that changed when the post-Cold War surge happened. The post-Cold War came in, and with it came a new consensus in the Security Council. We were no longer divided, and there was a common purpose, basically. And a large number of UN peacekeeping missions were deployed between '89 and '94, going from 11,000 peacekeepers to a total of, at the time, it was about 70,000 troops, actually. But the nature of the conflict had changed at that time. And instead of being deployed for interstate conflict, this was increasingly becoming intra-state conflict and civil wars, which challenged us, and we had to recalibrate. And while the military remained the backbone of our operations, a new phase of peacekeeping emerged. And there we had to deploy administrators, economists, police officers, legal experts, electoral observers to oversee elections that were happening in some of these countries, humanitarian workers, communication experts, governance specialists to work with the countries on state building and capacity building of their institutions. So we saw an incredible surge at that time. But with that, we also realized that increasingly we were being deployed into contexts where the guns had not been silenced. And it wasn't only about political settlements anymore. Because it was intrastate conflict, there wasn't always a very clear line. We fell into a problem in the 90s, and we had to reassess ourselves, mainly because of three operations: the former Yugoslavia, Rwanda, and Somalia. And for many, these were considered significant failures, and we were criticized significantly for failing to hold the peace, to protect the peace, and to protect the people. But we also realized we were not adequately resourced. We were not able to secure the political support and to be able to build on that. Because to go in, we were originally designed to go in and once a political agreement had been reached, then we would support it. But that was wavering, and it was very difficult to sustain that. So the 90s became a period of reassessment after these spectacular three operations, and we reassessed ourselves. And we came out with a greater understanding of our limits and our greater understanding of our potential. And I would argue that the UN was then tasked to perform even more complex tasks. And it started when we went back, we were into Kosovo, in the former Yugoslavia, as an interim administrator. We also were sent to Timor as an interim administrator while they were in the process of gaining their independence from Tunisia. And in the following years, the Council continued to establish large missions, and we found ourselves very stretched and increasingly called upon to operate in uncertain environments with volatile political contexts. We are in some of those contexts still today, and we have certainly adjusted. And we continue to address challenges of state building and stabilization and protection. And I would argue we have reduced even after 2010 because we have managed to exit from many of the countries where we worked, like Liberia, like Sierra Leone, like Cote d'Ivoire, like Haiti more recently, because we managed to create a sense of stability in these countries. Today, we are 80,000 troops, and we serve in 13 missions across the world. And we continue to bring stability and to support electoral processes and political governance and elections. I wanted to highlight also what are the conditions that are critical for us to operate in. And there are three basically that form that there has to be consent of the parties when we go in. And that we have to act in an impartial way, and that generally it's the non-use of force except in self-defense and defense of the mandate in very limited contexts. So we facilitate political processes and elections, we protect civilians, we do disarmament and demobilization, we restore the rule of law, and we promote human rights, is increasingly the role that we play today. Now, our troops and police contributors come from 122 countries across the world. And this is why I say it's such a statement of global solidarity. And our financial contributors are some of these countries, but also the US is our largest financial contributor in peacekeeping today, followed by China, that comes in second. And then we also have Germany and the UK, who are also significant contributors to peacekeeping. The US has a very strong presence in our operations. And I would argue that it still creates a secure and democratic, prosperous world for the benefit of the American people and the international community. And that's stated in the motto of the US Department of State. It shows the international community that the US is willing to engage in diplomatic efforts and the global interest related to that. I also wanted to say that peacekeeping is a very valuable investment and a very cheap investment for the American people. We are 0.5%, slightly less actually, of half of the military expenditure worldwide. We cost 6.5 billion a year across all our operations, which is a fraction of a percent. of what militaries spend across. And yet we bring and support stability to secure the citizens of the world, not just of the countries that we support, so that these conflicts don't also reverberate and overflow across borders and come to different parts of where you are. The 29th of May is also our Peacekeeping Day. And this year we're celebrating women in peacekeeping. This is a very important part of what we do, and we are targeting to have 25% of our military in women. At the moment, we are in staff offices doing it 16%, and even less at military contingent percent at barely 5%. In the police, we're almost at 30%. We do a lot better. And we are hoping, with the commitment of many of our member states, to continue growing the number of women in our operations, because they fundamentally change the way we do business in these conflict contexts. The diversity and the broadened skill set means that decision-making is done differently, and the results have proven to have greater operational effectiveness for our performance. So it's a fundamental part of our work. I'll quickly touch on how COVID is affecting us, of course, today. We're delivering on our mandates in all the countries where we are, but we're also working to support governments locally to respond to COVID. So a lot of our radios in Congo and in Mali have been totally reappropriated to support educating children, because they don't necessarily all have access to internet and cannot school, similar to many places in the world. So we use our radios, which reach the entire country. And they've also been used to raise awareness on how to prevent contacting COVID. We have used some of our community engagement committees to support also awareness and improve the engagement of women in these societies. Now, how do you get involved with supporting all of this? There is a United Nations Association, UNA-USA, and it's a movement that Americans have dedicated to supporting the United Nations. It's got 20,000 members, and we would really encourage you to look up their chapters. I actually think there is a chapter in Montana, Chris, if I'm not mistaken. And they certainly support us in many ways. I will just flag quickly maybe two of these ways that you can help us. I'm really sorry I can't show you the fantastic pictures that I've set up here.
No worries.
Right. So one way is that you get involved to help us advocate in your communities for the objectives and the principles and the values of the UN and the global order and the multilateral system that we have created for the past 7 decades. And another is connecting to the UN Foundation, which was launched by Ted Turner in 1998, and it connects people and ideas and resources to the UN as well. There's an example through the Better World campaign in which you can engage with members of Congress to raise your concerns over the impact of US arrears to UN peacekeeping, for instance, which are undermining some of our efforts. I would now actually like to be less challenged by technology and sorry. And thank you for taking the time today to have this chat with me. I wanted to close also by saying something. I'm looking for it here, that I cannot find it, Chris. Sorry, I cannot find what I am looking for. But maybe it's a good point to stop. Yeah. And if I can find it, I can take it back in questions. So over to you.
All right. Thank you very much, Rania. Despite the technological challenges, which we all have, thank you so much. I mean, it's a very interesting presentation on the changing face of peacekeeping operations and what it looks like today. I think we're all not familiar with that. So thanks for bringing that forward. I'd like to start with my friend and partner, Betsy, at the Jeanette Rankin Peace Center for any comment or question.
Well, thanks, Chris, and thank you, Rania. What a great work that you're doing, and always been a UN supporter, and so happy to know of all of the work that you're doing. You kind of echoed what Harriet said yesterday about the changing face of peace, in that people are getting more involved, and you've described peacekeeping in terms of more communication, and even the work that you're doing with helping countries with COVID and other things, that peace has taken on much bigger connotation of what that means for our world. So thank you for that. I know that women in the peacekeeping force is one of your initiatives, and I'm just curious about, in some of the countries, I expect there's some great challenges with women coming in that role, with countries that are primarily male dominated, and I'm just wondering what some of those challenges are, and some of what you're doing to recruit women.
Yep, over to you, Rania. Oh, unmute. There we go.
Yes,
Go
can
ahead.
you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your question, and it is one that definitely is at the forefront of our minds, because, as I said, women continue to be a very limited number in many of our troop and police contributing countries. And there is a huge effort that is ongoing now to work with the troop and contributing countries and police contributing countries to push and advocate for the importance of women in their own militaries and their own police. Because the last thing we want to do is to take the few that they have to make sure that we meet a quota % in our operations. But rather, the fundamental tenet is the importance of advocating for women across their militaries and their police, so that they benefit at their national levels, and then we are able to reap from that in our missions. And we have certainly seen a tremendous increase in those who serve in our missions, who go back to their national countries and advocate with other women. Generally, the rotations of troops are 6 months basis, and sometimes they are done on an annual basis. For many countries and for many women who are mothers, having that 1 year rotation without a break to go back and see their families is a challenge. And so we are working to try and see with some of the troop and police contributing countries if they can institute a break in the middle for them to go back and see their families. It helps us get more women in. We've also are working with some of the troop and police contributing countries in building the capacity of their women to take these language exams. Are often a barrier for them to be able to get in to peacekeeping. Because they may not have the English to get them across, or the French to operate in some of our missions. So we're trying to identify some of the barriers at national level and help work with them through them so that we benefit collectively.
Rania, not surprisingly, we have a lot of questions coming in from the chat function. I think we have time for one, possibly two, if you can squeeze it in. Question 1, what tools does the UN utilize to maintain objectivity and perception of being unbiased in the peacekeeping process, especially given that the UN's significant contributors are world powers?
Thank you, Chris. Right, it's a very yeah, it's a difficult question, because the Security Council does have the main powers of the world today, but it also has elected members who also bring the views of the rest of the world. And I think that's an important balance in our governance system relatively. Now, for us to go into missions, impartiality, as I was saying, is crucial to us maintaining the consent and cooperation of parties in the countries that we work in. And that's not to be confused with neutrality. I think it's important, because we're impartial in how we deal with parties to the conflict, but we're not neutral in our execution of the mandate. And just as a good referee is impartial, but will penalize infractions. So in peacekeeping, generally in our operations, we should not condone actions by parties that violate the undertakings of the peace process and the principles, but we uphold our principles to both. So I think it's really important for us to maintain the relationships with parties to the conflict. And what complicates this, I think, is when parties to the conflict have links to greater powers. And that complicates the peace process locally more for the people of that country than it does for us, to be honest. But I think we continue to take our role as civil servants in a very impartial way, and I think that's the only protection that continues to serve us.
Rania, I would normally close this off, but I've got a great question from another participant. Maybe you could squeeze this in 30 seconds. How are peacekeepers chosen, both in terms of nations and individual soldiers? Why not US, Russian, Chinese participation on the ground? Over to you for an answer and a wrap-up comment, please.
Thank you very much, Chris, for the question. And I mean, we welcome peacekeepers from all of our member states. And we have certainly, China has been increasing its numbers in peacekeeping significantly, as have others. Canada, the UK returned to peacekeeping after decades of not being involved. And I think it really is I would say, strong solidarity on the ground when you see these different forces from different contexts and different doctrines operating together in the service of peace. So by all means, everyone is welcome. Most countries have a certain test that is applied in the selection of who they bring then on as peacekeepers, and that's managed at national level. But our training teams and our Office of Military Affairs works very closely with those troop and police contributing countries. And we have seconded officers from most of our troop contributing countries and police contributing countries based in headquarters who also help us to manage this process and the selection. So it's quite rigorous and is done at two levels, by the national country and then by the United Nations. There are human rights elements that come into these selections to check that those coming to us are also not, don't have human rights violation records, which has been really important in the last 10 years, especially. I mean, finally, in closing, I would say, I think this is one of our most successful tools in the multilateral system. And we would appreciate all the support and advocacy that you could do to expand that knowledge and to dispel any misunderstandings of it in the US and more broadly. Thank you.
Rania, a great way to wrap it up. Absolutely. Thank you so much for the insight. It's the kind of depth and insight that we look for in this show. So thank you so much for your contribution. To everybody else out there, thanks a lot for joining. It is Peace Week, and tomorrow we have a very special guest, the former United Nations Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, Jan Egeland. Jan, maybe 20 years ago, as a foreign ministry official in Norway, was central to brokering the Oslo Peace Accords. He's also been involved in peace negotiations in Guatemala and in Uganda. So Jan comes to us with a wealth of experience being at the table in really key peace negotiations. I really hope you can join us. You heard Rania talk about Harriet Martin, who is also a peacemaker and author, was with us yesterday. Rania's with us today. Those two shows and all of our shows are available on our YouTube channel if you'd like to check them out. Why not take 25 minutes and learn something new? Special thanks again to the Jeanette Rankin Peace Center here in Missoula and Betsy and all of your colleagues. Thanks for joining us. We hope to see you all tomorrow. Until then, thank you very much and goodbye.